Well, I'm happy to go ahead and start. I would say one of the biggest barriers is not enough licensed professionals, licensed providers who are fluent in American Sign Language in different areas, be that the school system, be that the community. Access is definitely an issue. Those folks who are fluent in ASL, there's just not simply enough of them, and we definitely need more providers. Oh, did our last panelist join us? Anne, wonderful. Wonderful. Well, let's hold for just a second and pivot over to Anne so she can take the time to introduce herself.
One moment.
Yeah, just tell a little bit about your background and also describe what you're wearing and what you look like. And then we'll go back to our first question. Anne?
Oh, hello. I am Anne Fox, and I'm from Southern California. I've done previous work at the Taft Elementary School as a substitute teacher. Yeah.
Do you have children?
My son passed away. I had one child passed away recently.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon, actually. Okay, I guess morning for you in California. Probably.
Yeah, it's 11 o'clock here. It's still morning.
Okay, so we were just discussing, Terrylene, do you want to repeat the question real quickly? Sure, and so happy you could join us today. I'm so excited that you're here. It's nice to have a fellow Pacific Standard Time person on the panel. So that being said, the question is, what are some of the barriers to accessing mental health information and services and supports, be that in academia, in the community, at home? What are some of the barriers that are out there? So we just began the discussion with that first question, and Jennifer, she had just started to answer, and we're just so thrilled that you were able to join us. And so Jennifer, do you want to continue talking about barriers or? Sure. Okay, so I had just started to comment that a lack of professionals who are fluent in American Sign Language, the ability to provide those mental health services in a direct way is very limited. There's not enough trained professionals, like I said, who have that skill set. So I think that's a huge barrier for, our deaf children. There's just not enough access. Does anybody else want to add anything else?
Yeah, sure. I have something to say. Mary Carol here. I feel that when children go to regular school, maybe, for example, they could have like a coach and a counselor and a speech therapist and an audiologist. Are they aware of the deaf students and their needs? That can create a huge barrier because the child needs these various supports for their mental health and wellness as well. And in the community, let's say they're doing a soccer game and they want to join a soccer league. The neighbors are there and they have the coaches there, but there's also no communication to access for those deaf children. As well, if there's any meetings or discussion, maybe the interpreter might miss something, or maybe the interpreter's not there. In the hallway, often it's a big deal. You get so much information shared with hearing students when they're in the hallway. They can hear like the gossip and what's going on and all that information. Deaf students miss that. And Fox is speaking. Also, for parents that are hearing and the children are deaf, it's important that they have an interpreter there, because sometimes the parents don't sign at all or don't sign very well, and the deaf students, they miss out. It can be very difficult raising a deaf child with hearing parents because they feel like they're lost. So it's important to have that communication established at home and to have an interpreter when needed. That can be a really big barrier for parents that don't sign to their deaf children. They feel like they're, not part of the family.
Terrylene? Well, sure. I'd actually like to add on to Anne's comment. I couldn't agree more. I think mental and physical wellness starts at home. And so I completely agree. Parents, I guess the best way to put it, parents have to accept that, they go through a grieving process when they first find out that their child is deaf. That's a very common story that we hear from hearing parents. In my family, it was the opposite, of course. We celebrated this being multi-generational deaf. Just like you might celebrate your child being a coda or something like that. But that being said, a high percentage of parents, when they meet a deaf person, they definitely don't realize, that reaction has a powerful impact on that child. And that the child is taking in this information visually instead of auditorily, and they're always taking in information. And to see those reactions, they subsequently internalize a sense that there is, quote unquote, something wrong with them. And that impact is lifelong. So I think if parents accept and embrace their child, yes, they have a grieving process that they will go through, but take care of themselves and get the support they need from the community to work through that process. Maybe by interacting with deaf individuals, maybe by meeting members of the community, deaf people, not medical professionals, not necessarily audiologists. Even though, I'm in full support of audiological services if the family decides that, but really interacting with people from a human-centered place first, really getting to become familiar with the language. And while they're doing that, getting that support for themselves, at the same time, separating that and being able to focus and support their child and being able to interact with them and really instill within them a sense of positivity that they are a beautiful human being, and let that child take the lead. Let that child show them what's going to be right for them in terms of tools and approaches. Yes, I think the grief is a natural thing, and I've been there. Like I said earlier, I did lose my son, but that can really impact everything. My son struggled. He actually ended up, his death was self-inflicted, and we'll talk about that more later, but grief is very profound and it has a powerful impact, and it can very much skew everything else you try to accomplish. We need to kind of wake up when we're experiencing that process and help ourselves. I know I need to be the best I can for my daughter because my daughter needs me in the present. So that's just kind of one example, I think. Also, I do want to bring up PACES. That's a program at the American School for the Deaf, ASD, and they provide 24/7 therapeutic care. It's a therapeutic program. It's called PACES, PACES. And I think that's important to share with parents as a resource, specifically for those children who are struggling with severe mental health challenges. If it's an emotional behavioral issue, and if that's a strong concern, they have a great program. I think one of the biggest barriers is the lack of programs and some of the programs being closed because we don't have a lot of resources for supporting those deaf children. It gives me goosebumps when I think about it. So I just want to put that out there as a possible resource. And if you know of any other resources, I think this is a great place to share them.
Yes, this is Anne here. They have a new service where you can do a new phone number to
Suicide
call,
hotline.
the suicide hotline. But for deaf, we need more supports. Like I said, my son, he suffered from depression, anxiety, ADHD, addiction. So he constantly struggled with these things, and he had a really difficult time. Like if they had camp. What was that camp?
Boot camp.
Boot camp. Like, hearing people can go to different things, but if they had boot camp, like something like that, something to support him, for the deaf, if they had those options, like they have the 988 service.
Yeah, there's definitely barriers when it comes to accessing programs and services in camps.
Yeah, boot camp. Like I wanted him to get in some kind of boot camp to help with like the ADHD, the depression, his emotional issues. I wanted them all to be addressed in kind of like a boot camp structure program, with the things that they could focus on his issues, but we don't have that for the deaf. Mary Carol speaking. That kind of leads us to the next question, which is number 3. What do you think that the school, what can we do better? Like you were just mentioning that kind of program, a boot camp type of program or services. How effectively do you think schools address the topic of mental health, and what can we do better? Even if there's in the classroom, if they're in like a self isolated classroom or a mainstream classroom, there are things that we can do better to help our children. Because even when they're as young as 5 or 6 years old, sometimes they can already be struggling with some emotional issues, but they don't understand that. Like you were saying, why me? So if we could connect them with what's going on immediately, and they say, oh, this is what I'm feeling. Oh, I'm sad. Oh, I can be okay. This will help me. Like to teach them strategies early on and to help them with communication as well. Because as you were saying, it starts at home with that communication, and tell them it's okay. Like it's okay for boys to cry. To send them that message so they know that it's okay. So something like that I think would be great. Anne is saying, yes, as my son was struggling with depression and things like that, we put him on medication. And growing up, he was on his own. And he stopped taking his medication. And he decided to do pot instead because it gave him that same high. And he was drinking and he was
self-medicating.
the self-medicating. And I told him that to get back on his medication instead, but he didn't believe in that. He didn't want to do that. Yes, he was an adult. He found out on his own. So it was hard to manage. As a child, I could manage it, but when he became older, he was on his own and self-medicated the wrong way, and now he's gone.
And I think the second question is to accessing barriers to accessing mental health information in the school and in the community. Did we cover that one? Okay, so really that was the first and second questions that we covered. All right, just kind of referencing here. And the first one was introducing ourselves. Okay. So why don't we look at, I guess we're ready to move on to well, real quickly, I just want to stay on number 3, if you don't mind, as it relates to what can we do better. So I think stigma, first and foremost, we have to take care of that piece. We have to dismantle and end the stigma. We have to let our children know that it's okay to go to counseling. If you were struggling with something physical like your back, you would go to a chiropractor. If you're confused and feeling hurt, it's okay to sit down and talk to somebody about it. They're the same thing. So I think dismantling that stigma is important. I also feel that schools have counselors within the academic program. Okay, not perfect, but they have them. And I think we need to raise more awareness, particularly in the school and academic community, about the openness of the healing process, and that schools are also different. For example, deaf schools might have more resources in a specific area. Mainstream schools might have less. And of course, that's because of the issues with communication access and maybe not having counselors that sign, and that limits the opportunities for access for deaf students who are in those settings. But I think if we look at things big picture, there's a variety of different families out there. They're in a variety of different settings when it comes to school placement. Some families are not part of the deaf community or don't have the opportunity to be part of the deaf community. And they can't necessarily access that cultural wealth, that DCCW, which is, if I remember correctly, Flavia Fleischer. She actually created a framework about mental health and wellness from a cultural perspective and how to navigate things with that cultural capital, so to speak, and how we go through life as deaf people and the tools we develop and that we pass on to our children. You know, that framework is based on that, YOSO, and Dr. Flavia, she kind of added to that and added additional kind of components about the education piece, about the role of trauma, and the fact that deaf children experience trauma. I believe it's 1 out of every 2 deaf children will experience some kind of sexual abuse. And that's very much a silent epidemic. So the mental health struggles that are a result of that are pretty profound. I'm a child survivor of sexual abuse myself from 4 to 12 years old. So I'm certainly aware of, you know, how silent this is, very silent and very deadly in the deaf community, and that nobody's talking about it either in home or at school, regardless of where it takes place. I think later, you know, we need to talk about how to talk to our children about those types of topics as well, talking about things like personal safety and self-awareness. You know, it happened to me, so that's something that I wanted to ensure that my children didn't experience, and I had to kind of develop my own ways of explaining this to them, teaching them how to say something if something's happening to them. And if you can't protect yourself, you can still speak out, and you can tell me as your parent, for example. We need to educate our children about this specifically, and the fact that they have a voice and that they can speak out, and that we will do something about it as parents. And that's what we're here. We're here to support them. We're here to protect them if something happens. So if anything feels funny to them or gives them pause, that's the messaging that we want to give to them. All of this is kind of a layered scaffold of approach when it comes to mental health and wellness, specifically for deaf children, because they are, deaf and hard of hearing children are a vulnerable population when it comes to communication, because not everybody is fluent and not everybody has the skill and the ability to communicate with the specific group. And we're definitely lacking, and some children are lacking in language. They experience things like language deprivation. That's a whole nother layer when it comes to mental health and wellness, and that's a whole additional concern. So I don't know if anybody else, Mary Carol, if you want to add or.
Yes. Referring to the schools, I think it's important to have the parents involved as well. Sometimes we could do maybe like a series on mental health and have that involved in the curriculum. And we can talk about our emotions and behaviors and have the kids be able to identify, oh, I have that. But it helps them to be able to talk about them. Because oftentimes they feel safe maybe in the school, but not at home, or vice versa. So we really have to be careful and try to make it accessible and inclusive for all of our children, for the teachers to feel comfortable talking with them and having an open dialogue about that in the classroom. It should be a safety net. You know, maybe have like a my feelings poster with the happy face and the sad face. Even at a young age, that's important for the children to be able to see those images and be able to relate to them. Also, for be able to, like you were saying, to walk around and have like an open dialogue, have workshops. And like I said, when the parents can come and we can show the parents the resources that they have at the school. And so the parents can be aware of what's going on. I like as a liaison to build that trust between the parents and the school. Anybody else?
Well, I think I think it's important, if you're using an interpreter in the school system, for example, that they are very good and very fluent at catching the parts of ASL that don't take place on the hands, the grammar and the structure that takes place on the face or with the body language. Those points are often overlooked or misinterpreted. So I think the qualification of the interpreter is paramount, so that they see all of the language that's taking place if they're working with a student in public school or in a deaf school setting, making sure that we're hiring teachers that are experts when it comes to the language, who are fluent. And I think it's important that parents are on top of that and they're monitoring that to make sure that they're screening and making sure that the interpreters working with their children are qualified and that are going to catch all those nuances of languages. This is so that we can ensure that they have full access to any of the services that they might need. And of course, having staff that signs is amazing. I agree with both of the comments that have been made about being more open and doing away with stigma and letting people know that it's okay to talk with a counselor, that it's okay to talk with people to get the support you need. If, how do I say, I guess, before it becomes a bigger issue, being proactive, addressing it when it's still manageable before it becomes non-manageable, and finding the language and the support to be able to express maybe some of those bigger challenges that they will face later so that they can feel safe. I think we definitely need to encourage the school systems to do that as well for our students. Now, I did share with some of my colleagues just recently that when it comes to transition services and working with high school students to help prepare them for their future post-graduation, I think it's very important that we include an understanding of them and their own identity when it comes to mental health and well-being. We want them to understand what their needs are, what services are available, what they're going to need in terms of next steps when they're out there in the adult world. So the school plays a big role and has a huge responsibility in providing that type of education and making sure that they understand and can do that self-identification, that they know how to self-advocate, so they know how to express their wants and needs when they're out there in the world. And I think the school needs to do more in terms of offering more opportunities to practice those self-advocacy skills. That ultimately is going to lead to being able to access the appropriate services when they're out there in the community. That's a great point. Getting back to things we can do better is, I think, for example, if we're thinking about hospitals and the schools and mental health professionals, or how do I guess, those community resources, I think increased connection and collaboration to make sure that those resources are prepared to take in these students, checking, for example, to make sure they are well versed in how to provide access, like getting an interpreter. I do a lot of advocacy, both formal or informal. I've also done it just informally with friends. And I notice quite often out there in the community, okay, they are not prepared. If a child needs more support or the family needs more support that's not already within the community, they struggle. And typically they rely on one kind of point of contact, one counselor. So I think there needs to be better planning, better collaboration. And that's where transition comes in as well. As they transition, once they're ready to graduate and go out into the real world and go out into the community, they need to know how to navigate that. They need to know where those resources are. They need to know kind of where their home, where their tribe is out in that larger, greater world. And I think oftentimes that can be overwhelming. Parents who need additional support for their child rely on the school. And when that child ages out of school programs and eligibility, they kind of become lost. And then it starts kind of brainstorming. I think we need to do better and be more proactive and have a little bit more accountability to go to these agencies and help the families and the children have a smoother transition, make sure that they're ready, give them a little bit of assistance in finding and navigating all of that post-graduation. At Riverside, where I am, I'm sorry. At Riverside, where I'm currently located, just to give you an example of what this looks like in real time, I have seen over and over again single parents who just can't afford to live in the area. And the deaf school is the only opportunity they have. we have a lot of people and a lot of students who are homeless themselves. So they're coming into school homeless. So where is the support and resources for these students? Being able to contact the municipalities and get some support. Unfortunately, a lot of times the areas where these families traditionally live, the families with deaf children specifically can't afford to live in these areas because of gentrification and things of that nature. So it's a serious issue. And thinking about things like providing interpreters in hospitals, it's left to the community to fight for that. So I think it all goes back to resources and resource linkages, which I think is a very weak area and something we could definitely improve on. And I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I interrupted you while you were speaking. I was just saying we need to teach our children more independence and have an independence program for when graduating from high school. Like when you're finished from high school, what do you do next? Where's the independent programs to learn how to do things on your own? How to pay bills, how to take care of yourself. I think we need an independent program that's provided for our children.
So I think maybe it's important to build it into the school curriculum, teaching those independent living skills. And also how to ask for help if you need it. And to do it with pride, to know that it's okay without any sense of stigma. I think that's certainly a good area that could be addressed because the need for mental health services is increasing and the need for us to have that support in place is increasing as well. So I think we need to be ready to teach our children how to do that, how to self-advocate, like you mentioned, and how to ask for those services. Yeah, I certainly like that idea, Anne, of including, and Jennifer, of including in the curriculum. Now, for my undergraduate degree where I went for my BA, it was very interesting because they used a lot of Bible verses. Whatever I was learning, I had to at least include a Bible verse and find one that applied to a particular situation. I have a bachelor's in psychology. So it was very interesting, taking all these biblical verses and having them being infused within the curriculum. Okay, because this was a Baptist university. And I was thinking about like, okay, we need to do this when it comes to deafhood. We need to look at this and apply those same concepts and maybe, use that to develop the skill set. Dr. Flavia and Julie and Yoso and his community cultural wealth. When we take all of these different facets, all these different things, okay, and we use them to spread awareness for our children and spread awareness for our parents, I think we can also do that to train our staff. And I think that helps get the information out there. And I think that helps kind of strengthen our community from the inside out. Well, particularly in the areas of mental health and well-being, no question. I agree. All right, are we ready to move on to the next question? Mary Carol?
Sure. How important are parent support to use it as a tool? Yes. How important is it to you as a parent to support your child's mental health? Yeah, I feel it's very important to use these tools to try to teach our children responsibility. I think that's the key component. I think parents also have to be there to listen, especially, during uncomfortable situations. Not like during dinner time. That's not the appropriate time, maybe when they want to just vent and at night when it's, past their bedtime. Or early in the morning when they're waiting for the bus. It's always like sometimes inopportune times when the kids decide to share where we're going someplace or doing something, but that's the moment where they decide to express themselves. And if that moment arrives, we have to drop everything and listen because it's very sacred time. We have to stop and we have to listen and we have to be there to assist them in any way that they need it. And then that way they know we're together. I'm not going through this alone. Anyone else?
Well, for me, this question's really kind of huge. It's very important. It's asking how important. It's 100% our responsibility as parents to be ready, to be prepared, to support, in good times and in bad, in the ups and downs of life as our children navigate growing up. It's very hard. It's a challenge. We have to be willing, to learn from negative experiences. We have to teach them to learn from it and how to make them positive, and to be a role model for children too. Like, for example, if I'm having an argument with my husband, I'm deaf, he's deaf, one of our daughters is hearing. Okay. So showing that in signing things in front of them, like apologizing so that they see that, and modeling forgiveness and those types of things so that they see that in real time, so they understand what that's supposed to look like. Yes, you can have these deep private conversations, but there's also opportunities where we can model in real time what appropriate behaviors are supposed to look like. You can do that in a restaurant, if I'm given the wrong order or the right order, and how I solve that conflict with the waiter or the waitress or the server. So just doing that kind of modeling of those appropriate behaviors. I think for hearing parents, those who have deaf children, it's important to sign, even though maybe you and your husband or you and your wife don't need to sign to each other. You need to remember that your children are watching and that incidental learning is taking place. So make sure you're still doing it in sign, because they are always watching and you are modeling all the time, whether you're cognizant of it or not. And that's very, very powerful. That communication, not only that is direct, but that they see in their environment around them. That's very important.
Yes, yes, you're definitely right. Also, I wanted to add, I think it's important for children to learn conflict resolution. It's okay to disagree, that it's okay to get upset. It's okay to feel frustrated or angry, but learn how to cope with that. Coping skills is very important. If you're upset and you just hide in your room, they don't know what to do. If we're upset and we show that in private, they don't see that. But if they see, oh, it's normal to fight, it's normal to have disagreements. So as you were saying, to be transparent about that, I think is very important, to have that communication and model that, to say, it's okay, we get upset, it's all right. That way you feel valued. And to show the children, because sometimes they have like a sixth sense about things, even though you don't discuss it. They know when something's going on. They know when something's not right. They can feel it. They can read it. I mean, it's written all over our face sometimes. So we don't think, oh, our kids know. Our kids know.
Absolutely. Actually, I had two things come to mind as I'm watching this conversation. Okay, a safety plan, and how important. Let me just collect my thoughts. I wish, how do I put this? I did some, but looking back, I could have done more. I think every parent probably feels that way. When I lost my son, for example, I feel it's really important. It's little things like putting down like those yellow sticky notes in my yellow notes in my iPhone. The address to the hospital. Because in the moment of crisis, when a crisis happens, you lose the ability for rational thought, right? You don't have the ability to think. You use the ability to be logical and to reason, and you're trying to get there, for example, to the hospital, and you can't think clearly, of course, in those moments of crises. And having that kind of experience was really eye-opening to me, that I need to have a plan in place and have things documented in places that are easy to find, like on the refrigerator and so forth and so on, so that in a moment of crisis, you don't have to think. You have those things at your disposal, like phone numbers that I do not have memorized. Have them ready by the phone. I find myself little by little, just like Mary Carol said, I find myself little by little, like my son would remind me, he's like, I want to go for a walk. And to say something like, I'm going for a walk for 3 hours and I'm going to be awake all night, We could just sit up and have a beautiful conversation together. We did those things. That's what he needed at the moment. And I found myself very much like, oh, how do I put it? Just trying to balance my health with making sure that I was ready for him and being available for any time he might need me in a moment of crisis, and being able to support him, because sometimes it was just a matter of him wanting to be able to talk so that he wouldn't have to face essentially his demons that he was struggling with alone. There were times where he needed that, and where he needed to be able to pivot and get support from me. And I had to be ready at a moment's notice. So I highly recommend having what I like to call a safety plan in place and ready, so that you know where to go in a moment of crisis. You know who to reach out to. I did a lot of reading in terms of which hospitals had the best mental health services. I read reviews. I tried to reach out to those places, because I know one morning my son said that he was ready to go and I had to take him, and he was ready to go to the hospital. And I said, okay, let's do this. And, he had his typewriter as he walked out, the old heavy typewriter, and he's carrying it towards the door with his backpack ready to go. He was a beautiful writer. So he's sitting there, and I said, okay. And we go to the hospital, and I'm fully prepared, right? I'm driving him to the hospital at that moment. And first we go to the outpatient counseling, because I knew they had folks there who could sign, who were accessible. So we drove an hour to get there. We get there, and as we muddle through the red tape, the counselor informs us that honestly, the hospital doesn't have any interpreters, and it might be a worse experience for him. And so trying to figure out what to do and what next steps would be, was very isolating. And I was shocked, I'm a he needs help. What are you expecting me to do? And the response was basically, well, let's just go, go camping and meet some deaf people and go take a walk. And that's where we ended up going. We went to REI and we bought some camping sleeping bags and a new tent. And then we drove another hour and a half, something like that, north to meet up with, I think it was like a deaf group of hikers. I forgot what it was called. They were around, but it was a big deal. It was a huge deaf event. They were walking the entire coast of California. So we met up with them along the trail, and, Gio had a great time. He brought his typewriter with him, believe it or not. He sat out there in the wilderness and typed, because there weren't access to professionals and services. So I had to kind of think outside the box and be very creative and kind of develop a treatment plan off the cuff to get him what he needed. So I recommend having a safety plan in place, because what you think is going to be available might not be. So thanks for letting me share that.
Thank you. I'm watching the time. We have about 15 minutes left, so I want to make sure we're finishing up on the list. The next one, did you practice mental health and wellness during your childhood and your upbringing? Did you have techniques for self-care and therapy? Looking back at myself, I did have a full schedule. I had sports. I love sports. That was my outlet. That was definitely what I referred to as my, I went to a regular school. I didn't have interpreters until third grade. When I was in, I'm sorry,
Third grade through my second year of college.
third grade through my second year of college, I had to rely on lip reading. So sports was definitely my outlet. It was time for me to hang out and let loose and kind of relieve myself of all the stresses of the day. And I did have a group of friends that I hung out with. There were some deaf friends and hearing friends. So I had a good balance of friends. And I think that that was really important. And my parents too, they were very, very involved in my education. And my parents were hearing, but they tried to sign. We did like our own little homemade signs, but it was better than nothing. So that really helped to build myself of who I was. And it allowed me to work harder. And when I needed a break, I took time out, but that outlet was sports for me for sure. Anybody else?
Well, I can certainly add to that. Thinking about my own journey. I mean, admittedly, I come from a dysfunctional family growing up, so I have nothing, you know. One thing that I did, I think, for my children, again, coming back to talking about sexual abuse, because I'm a survivor myself from my childhood. So one thing I definitely did practice, is like when my children around bath time, when they were essentially, I would say 2, and we would talk about washing your body. But when we would get to the parts of their body that were covered by a swimsuit, I would give them the washcloth. And then I would take another washcloth and I would kind of model what they were supposed to do. And I would let them wash themselves, because I wanted to teach them to be autonomous. And I wanted to teach them, to value their privacy and that this was their body and nobody could interact with them without their permission. And around, 3 or 4 was the first time they went over to grandma's house for a sleepover. And apparently it was bath time. And grandma was shocked that when, they got to washing the areas of their body that are covered by a swimsuit, they took that washcloth, and I got a phone call and she was very surprised. And I was very surprised that my training even worked, I mean, as a mother, I'm respecting their privacy and their space. Then I was teaching them that nobody, if as a mother, I'm going to respect that privacy and safe space. Everybody has to, grandma, everybody. So I highly recommend teaching your children, particularly deaf children, that their body is theirs, that it is autonomous, that no one can touch it without their permission, and empower them by modeling being respectful of that privacy and of those boundaries. It works magic.
Yes, that reminds me. I do remember when I was about maybe 3.5, 4 years old, I was sent to the deaf residential school for the dorms for a week. And I was able to come home on the weekends. Fortunately, both of my parents sat down and explained it to me. They told me, my body is mine. And you're the only one that's allowed to touch it. And I remember that. So then when I was 8 and I was in the infirmary, and I stayed there for quite a while. I remember there was one little boy, he was 15. And he asked me, show me your body, show me your private parts. And I remember that like it was yesterday. And I knew that that was a red flag. And I said, oh, hold on, I have to go to the bathroom first. I'll be right back. And then, of course, I used that to escape. But because when I went to the bathroom, there was no windows there. So I thought, oh, what do I do? What do I do? I tried to figure out a map. I said, okay, if I go out the door and he's over there to the right and I can go to the left, there's a nurse over there. So I immediately went to the nurse without him even seeing me. And I asked the nurse, I said, please call home for me. And I remembered my phone number. Luckily, I knew my home phone number at that time. The nurse, I mean, she was busy. She was doing a lot of things. She really didn't have time for me. But thankfully, she listened. And she called and my mother answered and I shared her what was happening. And it was time for me to pick me up. And I was watching that clock and I was waiting. It was about an hour drive and I was waiting for any minute. And the boy's like, come on, come on. And I said, oh, the nurse needs me. Sorry, the nurse needs me. And I should take my temperature or do something. I was just buying time and trying to avoid him until my mother arrived. But I am so grateful that my parents instilled that in me at a young age and were able to communicate that with me and to tell me that. And that really impacted me a lot. I remember that story even right now.
Yeah, some parents are afraid, to talk about that. I think that's great that your parents did that. It also gives them the terminology that they need and the language that they need so that they can communicate these things. Sometimes there's a sense of shyness and you don't want to teach your children the terminology, the vocabulary to label the parts of their body. And a lot of parents, I think, explain that. Absolutely not. They need that terminology and they need it in American Sign Language so that they have the ability to talk about these things. I think that is language deprivation if you don't teach them the terms for the parts of their body. I think that's very important. Now, for me, in terms of practicing mental health and well-being, that came a little later in my journey. I would say 25 years ago, I was in a very bad car accident. It was very, very scary. And I ended up having to have a lot of surgery on my right hand as a result. And it was really difficult for me to get back in the car again. So that was probably my first experience going to see a counselor to overcome that fear, because I needed to be able to get back in the car and drive. I had to go to work. I had to function. I needed to be independent again. I was depending on my husband at that time and my mother, who had come to move in and help out as I recovered and get back on my feet. And that was a really important experience in my journey, because it really was eye-opening to me, experiencing therapy. And while I was in therapy for this particular issue, touching on other issues that had come up in my life. And then the ability to then translate that and impart that on my daughters, that it was such a positive experience, and talk about what therapy was like for me. Because deaf children don't have access to that incidental learning. They rely on visual learning that's a lot more intentional, or things being written down. So sharing that experience with them was, I think, a benefit. Self-care also for me means exercise, taking care of myself, making healthy choices in terms of the food I'm eating, all of those things. And I have had that experience as well. Yeah, I think that covers it for me. Anne, do you want to mention anything in terms of your well-being journey? Self-care you practice?
Well, my son, Adhan,
Had ADHD.
he had ADHD. So it was really important for me to be aware of food. Like, for example, like red food dye, we tried to avoid that. And there were several things that we tried to eat more nutritious and more holistic approach to food, and use that as a tool as well to help him with his ADHD.
All right, we're down to 5 minutes left. So I want to make sure we have an opportunity to address our last question. And I can go ahead and ask that one. Do you have any recommendations for developing accessible services for the community and children? So recommendations. You want to take it, Mary Carol?
Sure. I think it's very important to have a network and a collaboration with many different people as you can. The firefighters, the police, so the paramedics, the police. Sometimes they have open houses. Stop by. Bring your children to go see the ambulances and the EMT, the fire department. What do they do? And explain that to them. Talk with your neighbors. Be involved in community events. And that will help them see, especially for deaf children, that these are all people here to support me. Work with interpreting agencies. Work with the teachers and educators, the boards, the Board of Education. It's so important to be involved. The more you're involved and you show the child that as well, that everyone is here to help.
Agreed. Agreed. Very powerful. I think for me, reaching out and asking those questions, asking where resources are, who the good providers are, just asking the questions, not being afraid to ask the questions. Now there's more and more things, more and more new resources or approaches, might be deaf individuals or hearing people that can sign. There's more access. It's not enough, we definitely more, but there's starting to be more access to therapists who they can communicate directly with. So resources both for the school, both in the community. Also being sensitive to the various needs of different folks, depending on whether their issue is, for example, bipolar or schizophrenia. There's a long list of different mental health challenges, and the resource pool is small, just like our community. Okay. And there's a lot of barriers. So I think we need to reach out to get the information. And as we find more information, documenting that, developing some kind of directory, making sure that it's available for other people to follow behind you. I call it kind of makeshift, just everybody coming together, kind of just building the fort. That's been my approach. I serve on a mental health committee here in the Riverside area. And we're going to start developing those connections formally, curating those resources, identifying the resources that are local to our community as well as nationwide, and then figuring out how we can take those and generate that awareness in our community, as well as for our families who have deaf children. I mean, that's what we're going through at the moment. We had our first meeting yesterday, and so we're kind of starting from scratch. And I encourage, like, for example, Mary Carol said to get involved. I think that is important. I think that's the best thing you can do. Get involved, not only in your child's life, but also get involved with the greater community in terms of making those connections.
Also, I was trying to remember the name of the place where Lisa used to work. What was the name of that place?
Cody. CODIE.
Yeah. My son, I brought him there before, but they didn't have enough services.
So that's another one of those barriers. Well, that's more deaf advocacy. You were very specifically looking for something related to mental health and more support, stronger support. I understand that's a frustration.
Yeah, they didn't have that. Well, they need to add maybe more mental health, make it more, I don't know. But they need to add more mental health. And Mary Carol saying that's one thing that parents need to realize is each child is unique. So there's services. It's not supposed to be a cookie cutter. It's not a one size fits all. So what works for one might not work for someone else. So we need to look for what is best for our child. As the parents, we know that. So we need to find out what is best for what our child needs. So maybe, like I said, different things might apply to different situations. So yeah.
Well, another recommendation to make, kind of piggybacking on what you were saying about asking the child and not society, I think also utilizing the IEP as a tool and advocating for services via that route, because mental health and well-being is going to impact them from an educational perspective and their ability to access the curriculum and learn. If they're dealing with different situations and they don't know how to cope with those, that's going to impact them educationally, and ultimately have a negative impact on their possibility of maybe getting a diploma and leading ultimately to bigger challenges. So working with your IEP team in the school and requesting maybe an evaluation and asking for that to happen. And if your school doesn't have the licensed professionals like a psychologist necessary, then ask for one that specializes and knows how to work with deaf people. Advocate for that and explain your rationale. Explain that a regular hearing psychologist or psychiatrist is not going to be able to identify the specific nuances that come with a deaf individual and their needs. So advocate for deaf professionals to do those psychological evaluations, and work with your IEP team and ask for those additional services to support your child as it relates to their education.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, we're out of time, you guys. It's actually 3 o'clock
one more thing. I just wanted to add one more thing to what Jennifer was saying real quickly. Lead K. Don't forget Lead K. Okay, so the IEP and then the IFSP that focuses on family service plans. Look at Lead K as a resource. Okay, they're there to prevent things like language deprivation. Yes, every child needs 2 languages, English and ASL, because that leads to a healthy sense of well-being and healthy mental health. It's absolutely all related, all related.
Emma's back. Wow. What a powerful discussion. Thank you all so much again for taking the time and sharing your stories with us. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Emma. Oh, and thanks to the interpreters as well. I'm happy. Thank you, interpreters. And thank you for all the audience. I did drop a link for the website. If you look into the chat, you can see the links there that I provided. So if you look into the chat box, if anybody wants further information, there are links in the chat. And thank you again for the panelists. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And thank you everyone for joining us for this conversation. And please look out for our social media to join our next conversation that we'll be having next month related to adolescence and suicide in the deaf community.
Thanks for the opportunity. Take care, everyone.